Okay, good morning everybody. My name's Phil Skipper, I'm the Head of Strategy for Vodafone's IoT business. And before I start, just a big thanks to everyone who's taken time out from their busy schedule to actually come and listen to me today, which is, I hope, going to be an interesting and informative session. Now, I'm not going to talk about technology today. If you walk through that door, you can find loads of people with all clever technology. What I want to do is to spend a few minutes talking about what happens to companies when they adopt that technology, because I think this is becoming increasingly important that IoT is not a technology. IoT is actually a new way of doing business, and it comprises of two parts. Absolutely right. You need to have the technology. But in order to leverage the benefit of the technology, you need to change the way that you work. And what I want to do today is to just give you a bit of an insight into the challenges that we see, but also the opportunities that can be realised through digitization around IoT. And that's really what I want to talk to you today. And what we're also going to do is to give you a pretty good example at the end of one organisation, which is a charitable organisation, that's actually adopted IoT incredibly successfully. I want to tell you a little bit of the journey that they took in making the decision that it was the right time to embrace IoT and do things differently. Now, first things first, we need to take a couple of steps back. This whole concept of digitalisation around IoT is actually quite risky. So why do companies need to go on this journey? Now, everyone's telling us that there's the data and the technology, all the enablers are out there. The question really is, what is the outcome that people are looking for? So let's really reverse back and say, what's driving the change in the market? And for us, there's a number of key things, and these are not trends that Vodafone have invented. These are actually things that you can see in the market right now. So the first one is urbanisation. Over 60% of the world's population live in cities. That's only going to increase. That drives much more dense markets. Now that's an opportunity because you've got more customers in the same space. It's also a challenge because you're going to need to scale much, much faster. With larger markets and increased density comes congestion, and whilst we see that in terms of things like traffic, as we're trying to get into the fear of this morning, there's also a range of other issues in terms of congestion around the competitive landscape. Resources are also getting scarcer. So I don't think any one of us here has been able to avoid the conversations around climate change and plastics and the availability of water and so on. So wastage and the impact on the environment becomes critical. And this is not just about taking plastics out of the supply chain, it's being able to use the resources that you have much more effectively. Then, of course, you've got the well-being and the impact on society. And at the end of it, you've got to remain competitive. Now, what we're seeing in our business particularly is that the large multinational corporations have actually seen this coming. And they have been the early adopters of IoT. And they've been responding in some quite simple ways. One is to actually look at digitization as an opportunity to open new revenue streams. So there are many services out there today that only work through connectivity. Stolen vehicle tracking that Vodafone provide is a good example. It's not about the technology in the car, it's actually about the value in making sure that if your car is stolen, it is recovered for you. That's why we don't call it stolen vehicle tracking. That's the technology input. The actual business outcome is stolen vehicle recovery. Companies are also looking at digitization as a way to make their services quicker, faster, and more agile. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about faster services because there's a second element to this which I think is becoming increasingly important. In terms of being able to use resources, they've got to get greater efficiency. They've got to do what they do cheaper, faster, better, more consistent. And finally, and I think you heard in the previous session, around better insight. So the one thing is, don't consider an IoT device as something which gives you predictive maintenance data. Think of that IoT device as a generator of data. And I was talking to our new partner Geotab the other day, and they said, look, we do fleet management, but it's no longer about understanding what tyre wear is. It's really about understanding the bigger implications of how to run a fleet. Now, I'm just going to come back to this issue around faster services. Now, we all think about this as agile product development and all of those types of things. I think it's much more fundamental. I think it's about businesses changing their metabolic rate. So businesses have to increase their heartbeat. Now, I'm an old bloke, so when I was young, if I wanted to complain about something, I would send a letter to my supplier. And 3 months later, a letter would reappear on my doorstep with a £5 postal order and an apology. That's the way it used to work. So I could run my business on a 3-month cycle. With email, that gets more compressed. With social media, it becomes almost immediate. So if you complain about something on Twitter and a response has not been received on Twitter within 20 seconds, it's no longer an issue about the problem, it becomes an issue about the speed of response. And this concept about changing the heartbeat of a company becomes really, really important. You can only do that by fundamentally changing the way that business operates. And that brings us to this question of digitization being at the heart of digitalization is really centered around IoT. So we've got the traditional IoT processes, remote monitoring and location services and process automation. But in order to realize the true benefits, you've got to look on the other side of IoT. You've got to look at how can you develop products more effectively, how can you deliver that high response, high engagement customer service, and finally, how do you start to bill and monetize these services? And I hear a lot of talk about, we're going to have loads and loads of data, we're going to have loads of this. That's absolutely right. But from a business perspective, it becomes a question of how do you actually monetize and capture that value? Now, if you look, we've got an interesting balance point in IoT at the moment. So on one hand, we've got these global trends, and these are forcing organizations to change. But at the same time, and this is quite a unique position, we've got three technologies which are reaching maturity. The first one is IoT, the second one is the cloud, and the third one is data analytics. So you've got a market where everyone sees the requirement to change. At the same time, you've got three technologies maturing. Now, this is a really interesting position. And if we get this right, this is going to take IoT to the next level. There is a fourth component that no one ever talks about, and this is the availability of low-cost compute power. So now, of course, we've got cloud compute, near edge, far edge, more compute power in the device. So we're at one of these interesting tipping points in the market where there is a fundamental need to change at the same time that there is a set of potential technologies coming to market at the same time. Really interesting opportunity, and I think this will take IoT to the next level. Now, there is a downside. When you digitize a business, it is a one-way street. If you digitize, it's very difficult to come back. And that's because you need to process re-engineer your business. You have to change the way you do things. You have to go from paper to electronic, from manual to automated. But then, you then have to rely on a third-party ecosystem to deliver your service. And what we say is IoT becomes the piece that makes the customer experience reliant on someone else. So when we connect a device, we don't think about this as just being another technology sale. It's not just about another selling of a SIM card. This is about taking on an obligation for that customer to deliver his customer experience for the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years. And that is the crunch point in IoT. Now, large corporations have got this. So if you look at the large corporations which have already embraced IoT at scale, automotive companies, utilities, and the rest of it, these are organizations which have a really strong technology heritage. And they're able to have multiple stabs at the same problem and get it right. If you look at the smaller organisations, they look at it from a slightly different perspective. So if and this is an example from my business, I used to run a metering business. I used to have many vans going around, knocking on the doors, trying to get in and reading meters. If I had a man off sick, I actually just used to get the guys I had to read more meters. So I never used to get 100% reads, but I always used to get a significant proportion of the reads done. Okay, and that's because I had a really flexible manual process. When you go to something which is automated like smart metering, you either get 100% of the reads, or the worst case is you get none. So if you look at the UK, there's been a couple of interesting situations with telcos around being able to deliver connectivity service. The problem is when you're relying on that data to run your business, if the data isn't there, the business stops. And this is one of the key things, and if you've done that, it's then very difficult to go back to the way that you were working. So IoT requires companies to rethink around the risk and the approach and the mitigation to that risk of adopting IoT. And this is really at the heart of what Vodafone does. We don't look at this as a sales opportunity. We look at it as an after-sales opportunity, because it's the after-sales that count. And I think when we move away from saying there's loads of technologies and we move into this idea of being able to run a transactional service business, you see IoT in a very different perspective. And this becomes increasingly interesting if you move into the mid-market. So most of our organisations today sit up there, they're multinational corporations, they've got large technology groups, they're almost as expert as we are in how they want to use connectivity. Move down, and this is where we're seeing a lot of interest in IoT, because the smaller organisations realise that if they digitise around IoT, they can actually start to punch above their weight in global markets. But they have a different ask. They don't come and ask us about, the IMSI this and the standard that and all the rest of it. They come and ask us for an outcome-based solution. So they say, look, I want to digitise my business. What I need is a solution that gives me this outcome. They've realised that internal developments have limited success. So the numbers are about 20% of internal developments are successful. About 60% of third-party ones are successful. So the internal development really doesn't work very well. And for these smaller companies, there is a disproportionate risk of failure. So they can't afford to have two goes at this. They need to get it right, and they need to get it right first time. And that gives them a very, very different mindset. If you're big and you can afford it, you can have multiple goes and multiple bites at the same cherry. These guys are in a situation where they need to change their business, change it fast, and make sure it's absolutely right. So, we connect just under 100 million connections. We're seeing really interesting growth in the mid-market, but all of our customers are coming to us and saying, how can you de-risk digitising around IoT? And the way we do it is absolutely, it's quite obvious if you take a couple of steps back. We make it very, very simple. So these organisations do not want to become as expert as I am in IoT, because they've got bigger and better things to do in terms of driving their own business. So we need to make it simple. We need to make it fast. We need to use what works, and these companies want to buy it as a service. So the market is moving from what a telco wants to sell to what a customer wants to buy. We then need to make it scalable. We need to make it easy for these organisations to scale to multiple markets and to flex their infrastructure in order to fit their growth patterns. And that's really where things like cloud and edge come together with IoT. And then the final bit is you need to have this ecosystem of trust. Everyone talks about the ecosystem as the way that the whole thing is going to glue together. And they're absolutely right. But how do you make sure that that ecosystem is going to be there when you need it? And many of these large organisations have a choice. They can use internal development, they can use external big developers, or they can use local developers. But how do they know that they're going to be able to access those services for the lifetime of the platform that they're now running their business on. So they want an ecosystem of trust, an ecosystem with experience, and this idea of low execution risk. So we've been playing with this idea for quite a while. And what we've actually done is we've introduced an application platform called Invent. And you can see it on the stand, wander out there, and you can see the applications that we've put on it. And we've actually taken quite a different approach. So Vodafone is somewhat lucky in we have lots of regional operating companies which sit in the country, and they've got a base, they've got loads of people working for them, we've got sales and support and so on. When you talk about the mid-market, you're talking about a much wider ecosystem of many, many more verticals, and those verticals are typically across, they're both localized but very, very broad. You've also got customers that really want to contract in their local language, they want to talk in their local language, they want to specify in their local language, and they want to be supported in their local language. So the first thing we do is we make it accessible locally. Then we take all the knowledge that we have in terms of IoT and we build it in very simple components on the platform. Now, I'm going to burst the bubble here and say there are actually only 2 use classes for IoT. Forget all the hundreds of applications you see, there's actually only 2. The first one is remote monitoring, the second one is mobile asset tracking, and you can do, I think, every application out there using one or the other or both of those key use classes. Interesting enough, 5G opens up a third one, which is about control. So when we have 5G for controlling turntables and AGVs and the rest of it, you can then start to use IoT as a control network. So over the foreseeable future, there's going to be 3 main use classes: remote monitoring, mobile asset tracking, and control. You can put all of those together in a set of components, which takes you 80% up the learning curve. And then what happens, companies can get on the platform and develop the remaining 20%. So we're moving away from this idea of co-creation, and we're moving towards a world where you have co-configuration. So you're adding the 20% that you need to make it a connected rat trap or a connected chiller or a connected HVAC system, rather than having to start from scratch and building everything up again. The final bit about Invent is that Vodafone positions ourselves at the centre of the ecosystem. So companies can contract with Vodafone, they can continue to contract with Vodafone through the lifetime of their project. So the risk of the ecosystem disappearing is significantly reduced because at the heart of it is an organisation that has a large business in your country. It's an organisation that has a business which only does IoT, and it's a business which is underpinned by a massive mobile base. So put those things together and you start to hit the topics. Local capability, you've got application as a service, you're delivering 80% as standard and 20% as configurable, and then you've got an ecosystem you can really rely on. So the message today for me is, look, digitization is actually a change in direction. It's not actually a technology. The real question is, how do you adopt that technology? And more importantly, how do you make sure that that's the right technology on which to base your business for the foreseeable future? Secondly, that these ecosystems exist. And the ecosystems, if you get them right, can really minimize the risk of change. And the third one is, even though you might see the risk of digitizing around IoT as disproportionately high, if you're a small or medium-sized company, the benefits are also disproportionately high. So this concept of using a platform, digitizing and punching above your weight in terms of the global landscape is really, really important. And I just want to close by talking about just one example. And this is Mencap. Mencap is a smallish charity based in the UK. And what they do is they help people with physical and mental disabilities live a better life in their own home. So they operate sheltered accommodation, they operate residential care and so on. And they came to us and said, look, we're a small organisation, but we've got some really interesting ideas about how we can improve the quality of life for people living in our accommodation, but we need to monitor them, we need to do it non-obtrusively, we need to be able to extend our duty of care into the places they live. But we really want to do it in a far more seamless way than we do. What can Vodafone do to help us? So we have a charitable foundation called the Voda Foundation. They had a conversation with Mencap, and we decided to see what it would be like if we could build that solution on this event program. And by doing that, we can actually show Mencap very quickly the benefits, we could show them what they needed, and more importantly, we enabled them to change what they wanted to do through the life cycle of the project. Now, I'll share another secret with you. I've delivered loads and loads of projects in my life. None of them have ever been to specification. And that's because when I start, the specification is one thing, and when I finish, the specification is something else. Being able to manage that process is really important, because let's be honest, any company that's digitizing has never done it before. So how do we know that they're expert in what they're trying to achieve when it's unknown? And this is where this ecosystem of risk really starts to come into play, where you can actually start to build an ecosystem that brings you both the knowledge but also the surety that you can deliver the outcome that you're after. So I've got a few minutes left, and what I want to do is to just play you a video which explains a bit about Mencap. So I hope you find it interesting. Roll that video, please. They told me to cue it up. There we go, fantastic.
Mencap aim to break down society's attitudes towards learning disability to help people live a life just like you and I would expect to live every day.
The Connected Living project came about 18 months ago to try to find solutions for people with a learning disability to have more tailored and personalised support, which use technology at the heart of that solution.
The technology can be used to help make them more independent. It can help give them control of their environment and their surroundings, and also make it safer for them.
It made me feel like more engaged. I'm feeling now great.
I've been involved with the Vodafone development team the whole way through. They were amazing. Every bit of feedback got taken on board and changed. They always asked me what could be improved. Some of the apps I actually suggested, like the shopping list one.
If it enables people with a disability to be more independent, there is less pressure on the family, and that's good for everybody.
Fantastic. So that's really just to sum up around IoT, digitising around IoT is really a power to connect for good. And I think when you're thinking about doing it, think about how you're going to operate it, think about the long lifetime. The technology is only the start of the journey. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you for taking the time out from the event. That's great. I will leave you to it. Thank you all. I think we've got a couple of minutes. Do I do questions? I'll ask the audience. Does anyone have a question before I go? Very good. Okay, thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.